Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cathleen Lewis, and I'm going to do Ask an Expert today, and I'm going to talk about the preparations for the first human space flights. Good afternoon. As a space history curator, I'm always preoccupied with anniversaries, and as many of you are aware, right now we're on the 42nd anniversary of the Apollo 8 mission around the moon, the first circumlunar mission. A manned mission. But what I'm more preoccupied with right now is that we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the first human space flights. And there was a lot of preparation going into that that many people are not aware of. We're between 1957 and 1961, we've got just a whole slew of 50th anniversaries of certain missions that we're building on to the first human space flight. The idea of sending a human into space had been part of myth, legend, and folklore really throughout history. It became a subject of science fiction during the 19th century, but it was still a complex deal, and it took a lot of innovation on the part of engineers and technicians during the beginning of the 20th century to really work out developing first and foremost the ICBM that was necessary to lift that amount of weight of a human and everything that would be required into space. But once that was solved with the ICBM, then became the really dirty details, work on the really dirty details of getting humans into space. You had to have, as I said, a heavy launch vehicle, a spacecraft that would seal out in the vacuum of space, life support that would supply oxygen and anything else a human would need to survive. They had to train the humans to get into space. They needed command and control to be able to track and relay data and information between the spacecraft, and they also needed a way to recover the spacecraft. And it all sounds very simple and neat now that we're 50 years out, but it took a lot of work. And the scientists and engineers who worked on this started very early. There's a prehistory of human spaceflight from the end of World War II through the 1950s when scientists were sending animals into space. They sent fruit flies on board V2 rockets in the United States out of Marshall at the Redstone Center in 1947. They sent a mouse on the V2 in 1950. They, on the Russian side, they were using their own version of the V2, and they sent two dogs, Sigan and Jizek, in January 1950. These were all suborbital flights, just high altitude flights, just to see how the animals respond to high altitude. And then in May 1959, the United States sent two monkeys, Abel, a rhesus monkey, and Baker, a squirrel monkey, on a Jupiter intermediate range ballistic missile up into high altitude flight. So those were the sort of two sides. And what's very interesting that both the Russians and the Americans, competing in a Cold War, were competing to beat the world in the space race, to demonstrate that they were the masters of technology, but they both also had their interest in sending humans into space, and in competition, completely separate and independently, they were working to send men into space. The real history of supporting that human life into space begins as early as 1957, when Leika, November 1957, Leika the dog was sent up in orbit in space. It was rather premature on their part. They hadn't worked out the details. The spacecraft failed. Leika died probably within a few hours after entering an orbit. But the real accomplishment of that was sending this massive spacecraft into orbit, but also demonstrating that any life, any living being could survive the trauma of launch and orbiting around the Earth. And that trauma was very concerning because people really didn't know how life would respond to that. So even though Leika, the experiment itself, was a failure, having Leika up into space and orbiting was a great demonstration of their ability to survive it. The Russians went on the similar track. They continued to experiment with dogs, as they had with the early dogs in the high altitude tests on board their early V2 derivative through Leika. They sent on August 19th, 1960, they sent 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, on board Sputnik 5, which was also known as Karabil Sputnik, or simply spacecraft 2. And they sent them up in orbit for a day-long mission. It was about 17 orbits of the Earth. And they brought them back. They were able to recover them. They survived. They were healthy. And not only that, one of the dogs, Strelka, actually had puppies a few months afterwards. Just about 50 years ago today, the litter was born. And the puppies are very, very interesting because to everyone, because everyone's always been preoccupied by presidential animals. And Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev gave one of the puppies, one of Strelka's puppies, to Carolyn Kennedy through the White House. And apparently she held on to the puppies and the puppy, and that puppy bred with one of her other dogs. She apparently had a whole menagerie as a child, a wonderful childhood. And those surviving puppies live to this day. They've been sort of farmed out to various friends and family members over the years. On the other side, in the United States, we were working more on primate investigations. We had sent squirrel monkeys up, and then we, in January 31st, 1961, a few months after Belka and Strelka were recovered and had their litter, Ham, a chimpanzee, was sent up and launched on a Mercury Redstone on a suborbital flight, similar to what Alan Shepard would later take. Later in that year, NASA sent Enos, another chimp, up in November 1961. And then finally, in March 1961, the Soviet Union had 2 flights, orbital flights, doing their final test out of the spacecraft. And that's why we're here today. There were 2 missions. The first was March 9th, 1961, and they had one thing in common. It was a test out of the Vostok spacecraft hardware, but it was also a test out of the system. And both missions, the first one included, took on board this mannequin, Ivanovich, which is basically the Russian equivalent of John Doe. And he's very interesting, first of all, because he's not really a mannequin per se. He was made by the Moscow Prosthetics Institute, so he's made to look very, very lifelike. He, in fact, has maquettes written across his head, which is the Russian word for model or mannequin. The same thing, just so anyone who found him after he landed would know that he was not a human being who was dead. This was not some sort of carcass in space. As I said, he was sent into orbit twice. His suit itself was not pressurized and apparently not capable of pressurization because they were not testing the spacesuit capabilities. The Russians chose to check their spacesuit reliability in vacuum chambers, and on the inside of his spacesuit, he had instrumentation to read the temperature, pressure, and humidity inside the spacecraft. So they were trying to verify that the spacecraft systems were working and that the suit would serve its primary function as an emergency suit, a get-me-down suit, when the passenger ejected at 20,000 feet. So it didn't really need to operate in a total vacuum. On his first mission, he went up into space along with a dog, Chernushka, reptiles, a couple of frogs, guinea pigs, and he had cages built into his torso with rats inside. So they were sampling every place in the spacecraft. The dog was tucked underneath him. The guinea pigs and the rats were embedded inside him, just to give an idea of what the readings and what the survivability were in different places in the spacecraft. And if you ever look at the size of the spacecraft, it's pretty small, so they had the thing jam-packed full of life in there. Also inside, he had a tape recorder, or a recording. And what the technicians and engineers decided is that in order to enhance the mannequin written across his forehead, that they were going to also make sure that no one mistaked him for a human. They had a choir singing on the recording. so that no one would be confused that this was a real human being, and also no one would be confused when hearing the recording coming down from a spacecraft that maybe this was a real human being or a human's voice. That mission was successful. All the animals were recovered. Ivan was recovered, refitted, and ready for his next flight, which took place on March 23rd, 1961. He went up with yet another dog, and Zvezdichka, little star, also with the recording, with the guinea pigs, and also the recording included not only the choir, but this time they had somebody reading a recipe for cabbage soup recorded, just as a part of sense of humor. We came about acquiring the suit for display on behalf, as a benefit from the Perot Foundation, which bought it on auction in 1993, and they've generously loaned it to us for his exhibit. It really gives you a sense of what the cosmonaut was doing, how he looked like for pretty much all of his flight for those early Vostok flights. With the knees bent, he's in a crouched position. He had to be in this position because he would be ejected, as I mentioned, in the final 20,000-foot mark of returning into the Earth's atmosphere through a cylindrical ejection seat out of the spacecraft, because at that time the Soviets couldn't slow their spacecraft down sufficiently enough that if a human had been inside, they would be able to survive it. Even though the dogs, Belka and Stroka, actually did survive their re-entry at a much smaller, lighter version of the spacecraft. This suit is made by the same company that made Yuri Gagarin's training suit that you see on the other side of this wall. As I said, it was not pressurized. It was not intended to be pressurized. It was just mainly to fit the mannequin, fit the ejection seat, and fit the parachute that he was wearing for his ejection and falling down to Earth. So I'm taking you up to next spring, and at the end of March of next year, we'll have a small display on the history of both Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard's flight, and what both sides were doing to prepare for that, and the excitement that occurred during that period, and just actually finally achieving getting a human into space after all those details. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Ask an Expert. A companion question and answer session for this lecture may also be available. For a schedule of upcoming Ask an Expert lectures at the museum, please visit www.nasm.si.edu.